The morning sun painted the sky with soft golden hues, casting a warm glow over the quiet village. Birds sang their sweet melodies, and the scent of fresh earth filled the air as farmers stepped into the fields, ready to embrace another day. The village was alive, peaceful, untouched by the troubles of the world. In a small hut near the river, Abeni moved gracefully, her hands busy preparing breakfast. Her belly was round with life, her heart filled with dreams of the little one growing inside her. She hummed a soft tune, a song her mother once sang, believing that love and warmth could shape the world of her unborn child. To the villagers, she and Zuberi were the perfect couple, young, in love, and soon to be parents. Women admired her dedication, men respected Zuberi's strength, and elders blessed their home, believing it to be a house of joy. But behind closed doors, the truth was different. Zuberi wasn't the man the village thought he was. To outsiders, he was charming, always wearing a confident smile, laughing with his friends, and speaking sweet words to Abeni in public. But when no one was watching, the mask slipped. His love had turned to anger. His hands that once caressed now left bruises. His voice that once whispered sweet promises now cut like a blade. Abeni hid her pain well, wrapping herself in silence, hoping that one day things would change. As the sun climbed higher, villagers greeted Zuberi with respect, nodding as he passed. He walked with pride, knowing no one saw the monster within. And Abeni? She simply smiled, swallowing her sorrow, pretending that the love she once knew still existed. But deep down, a shadow loomed over her heart, whispering a truth she refused to face. This happiness was only an illusion, and illusions never last forever. At first, Zuberi was everything Abeni had dreamed of, kind, protective, full of love. He would hold her close at night, whispering about the beautiful life they would build together. She believed in him, in his promises, in the warmth of his embrace. But love can fade like morning mist, and soon, the man she married began to change. It started with little things, harsh words when he was frustrated, long nights away from home, a coldness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He claimed he was working hard for their future, but Abeni knew better. She saw the tension in his jaw when he returned late, smelled the bitter scent of alcohol on his breath, and noticed the way his hands shook with rage when things didn't go his way. The gambling came next. Zuberi was never satisfied with what he had. He wanted more money, more respect, more power. He spent nights at hidden gatherings, betting on games of chance, believing luck would favor him. But luck is a cruel mistress. Instead of winning, he lost, again and again. With every loss, his frustration grew, twisting into something dark, and when he had no one else to blame, he turned to the one person who had always stood by his side, Abeni. At first, it was just shouting, angry words thrown like daggers, piercing her heart, but leaving no visible wounds. Then came the shoving, the grabbing of her wrist just a little too hard, the way his hand would hover in the air as if daring himself to cross a line. And one night, he did. The first slap stole the breath from her lungs. She stared at him, wide-eyed, unable to believe the man she loved had just raised a hand against her. He looked shocked too, as if he hadn't meant to do it. For a moment, she thought he would apologize, that he would fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness. But instead, he sneered, muttering that it was her fault, that she made him angry, that she should have been more careful with her words. And just like that, the monster was born. From that night on, the bruises became a part of her. Some she could hide beneath long sleeves and careful movements. Others lingered in her eyes, in the way she flinched when he raised his voice, in the quiet sadness that never seemed to leave her face. She told herself it would get better, that this was just a rough patch. She prayed to the ancestors, to the spirits of the land, begging them to bring back the man she married. But prayers do not change a man who does not wish to be changed. The village began to notice the way Abeni walked slower than before, the way she avoided looking people in the eye, the way she no longer laughed like she once did. Whispers spread like wildfire, but no one dared to interfere. Some believed it was a husband's right to discipline his wife. Others felt pity, but told themselves it was not their place to step in. A few saw the truth in her eyes, but turned away, pretending they did not see. And so, Abeni suffered in silence. She still cooked his meals, still cleaned their home, still greeted him with a forced smile when he returned. But inside, she was breaking. Every cruel word, every strike, Every night spent crying into her pillow chipped away at the love she once held for him. She no longer dreamed of a happy life. She no longer whispered to her unborn child about a future filled with love. Now, she only hoped to survive. But monsters never stop at just one bite. They always hunger for more. Zuberi's anger became unpredictable. Some nights, he would return home and collapse into bed, ignoring her entirely. Other nights, he would throw things, yell, remind her that she was nothing without him. And then there were the worst nights, the ones where his hands were not just fists, but shackles, pinning her down, making her feel as small and powerless as the wind against a storm. She wanted to leave. She dreamed of running far, far away, where his voice could no longer reach her, where his hands could never touch her again. But where would she go? She had no family left, no money of her own. The village would not protect her, and she was carrying his child, a child she had promised to keep safe. So she stayed. She stayed because she believed deep down that maybe, just maybe, the man she loved was still there, buried beneath the anger, beneath the cruelty. She stayed because she thought that if she just loved him enough, if she was patient enough, he would change. But monsters do not change. They only grow hungrier. And one day, Zuberi would cross the final line, one that even he could never return from. The night was heavy with silence. The village had long since gone to sleep, the only sounds being the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional howl of the wind. But inside Abeni's home, a storm was brewing. She sat near the fire, her hands trembling as she placed a warm bowl of food on the wooden table. Zuberi was late again. She knew what that meant. He had been drinking, and when he drank, he became a man she did not recognize. The door slammed open, making her flinch. Zuberi staggered in, reeking of alcohol and bitterness. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw clenched tight. He didn't acknowledge her presence. He never did on nights like this. He simply kicked off his sandals and slumped onto the chair. Abeni, swallowing her fear, moved carefully, placing the bowl in front of him. "I made your favorite," she said softly, hoping, praying, that this night would pass without pain. But fate had other plans. Zuberi glanced at the food, his expression twisting with disgust. Without a word, he grabbed the bowl and flung it across the room. The clay shattered against the wall, the warm stew splattering like blood across the floor. "Is this what you expect me to eat?" he roared, his voice thick with rage. "You can't even do one thing right." Abeni froze. She had seen this before, the sharp rise of his temper, the way his hands curled into fists. But tonight, there was something worse in his eyes, something unhinged, something that didn't just want to hurt, it wanted to destroy. "Zuberi, please," she whispered, taking a step back, her hands instinctively cradling her belly. The baby! But he didn't care. He never did. Before she could move, his hand lashed out, striking her across the face. The force sent her stumbling, her knees hitting the hard floor. Pain exploded through her cheek, hot and sharp, but she barely had time to process it before he was on her again. Blow after blow, kick after kick. She screamed, she begged, she clutched her stomach, shielding her unborn child with shaking hands. "Please, Zuberi, our baby, stop!" But her pleas only fueled his rage. He grabbed her by the hair, dragging her up, his breath hot against her ear. "You think I care?" he spat. "You and that thing inside you have ruined my life." Abeni sobbed, her vision blurred with tears and pain. This was not the man she married. This was a demon wearing his skin. And then, with one final act of cruelty, he grabbed her by the arms and dragged her toward the door. "Zuberi, no!" "Please," she cried, struggling against his grip. "I have nowhere to go." But he didn't listen. He never listened. With a grunt, he shoved her out into the night. Abeni fell hard onto the cold ground, her body curling instinctively to protect the child inside her. The night air bit into her skin, the ground damp and unforgiving beneath her. She tried to crawl back, tried to plead one last time, but the door slammed shut in her face. The wind howled around her, as if mourning her fate. The village slept peacefully, unaware of the horror that had just unfolded. Shivering, bleeding, and alone, Abeni curled up against the cold earth, whispering to the tiny life inside her. "Stay with me, my love," she murmured, her voice weak, her hands trembling. "I will keep you safe, I promise." But the night was long, and promises meant nothing to the darkness. The night was merciless. Abeni lay on the cold, unforgiving ground, her body battered, her spirit shattered. The man she had loved, the father of her child, had thrown her away like she was nothing. Her trembling fingers clutched her swollen belly, feeling the faint movements of life within. Her child was still there, still fighting. Tears streamed down her bruised face as she whispered into the darkness, "Stay with me, my little one. I will protect you, I promise." But how? She had nowhere to go, no home, no warmth, just the bitter night air biting into her skin, the weight of betrayal pressing down on her like a crushing tide. The village was silent, unaware of the woman who lay broken at its edge. She knew she couldn't stay there. Zuberi wouldn't come looking for her, not to bring her back, not to ask for forgiveness. He had made his decision. She was nothing to him now. With a deep, shuddering breath, Abeni forced herself onto her hands and knees. Pain shot through her body, but she gritted her teeth. She couldn't stop, not now. She crawled forward, each movement sending waves of agony through her. Blood trickled from her wounds, mixing with the dirt beneath her palms. The village lights faded behind her as she dragged herself toward the dense forest ahead. It was dangerous, but she had no choice. The trees stood tall and unyielding, whispering in the wind, watching her struggle. The night felt endless. Every step, every breath was a battle. The cold seeped into her bones, and exhaustion clung to her like a curse. Her vision blurred, but she kept moving. She had to. She didn't know how long she had been crawling when she saw it. A flicker of light in the distance. A small warm glow fighting against the darkness. Hope surged in her chest. With the last of her strength, she reached out toward the light. Her body gave in before she could reach the door, collapsing just outside a small hut. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her fingers clawing at the dirt. Then, the darkness took her. Morning came with the soft murmur of birds and the rustling of leaves. Mama Nia, the village healer, stepped outside her hut, stretching her tired limbs. But as soon as she glanced toward the ground, her breath caught in her throat. Abeni lay there, motionless, her body curled protectively around her belly. Blood stained her torn clothes, her face was swollen, and her hands were scraped raw. Mama Nia's heart clenched. She had seen suffering before, but this was something else. "Abeni," she whispered, kneeling beside the broken woman. She placed a hand on her forehead, burning with fever. She moved quickly, carefully lifting Abeni into her arms and carrying her inside. She was so light, too light, as if life itself was slipping away from her. Inside, the room was warm, the scent of herbs filling the air. Mama Nia laid Abeni on a straw mat, brushing damp hair from her bruised face. "Child, what have they done to you?" Abeni stirred, her lips parting as she let out a weak, trembling breath. "My baby," she whispered. Mama Nia's eyes softened. She placed a gentle hand on Abeni's belly, feeling the faint but steady movement beneath her palm. "Your baby is strong, just like you," she said softly. Tears slipped from Abeni's eyes. "He left me, threw me away." Her voice cracked with pain, not just from her wounds, but from the betrayal that had shattered her heart. Mama Nia's face darkened. She had heard whispers about Zuberi's temper, but this was unforgivable. "You are safe now, child," Mama Nia murmured, dipping a cloth into warm water and dabbing at Abeni's wounds. "No man like that will ever touch you again." Abeni's fingers curled weakly around Mama Nia's hand, holding on as if afraid she would be torn away once more. "I wanted to protect him, my child." "And you will," Mama Nia assured her. "But first, you must heal." The old healer worked tirelessly, mixing herbs, whispering prayers, and tending to Abeni's broken body. Hours passed, and slowly, the fever began to break. Abeni's breathing steadied. Her hands, once trembling, now rested gently over her unborn child. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she thought she had lost forever: hope. Zuberi woke up with a pounding headache, the stench of alcohol still clinging to his breath. He groaned, rubbing his temples as he sat up. The house was silent, the air stale. He glanced around, expecting to see Abeni scurrying about, preparing his breakfast like she always did. But there was no sound of clattering pots, no soft footsteps, no timid voice greeting him. He frowned. "Abeni!" he barked, waiting for her to appear. Silence. Annoyed, he pushed himself off the bed and stumbled toward the kitchen. The fire in the stove was cold, the pots untouched. His stomach growled, and frustration bubbled inside him. "Useless woman," he muttered under his breath, convinced she was hiding somewhere, sulking. But as he searched the small house, dread began creeping in. Her clothes were gone. The blanket she used was missing. She had left. A cruel smirk curled his lips. "She won't last a day without me," he scoffed. Abeni was weak, fragile. She needed him. She had nowhere to go. She would come crawling back, begging for forgiveness. Or so he thought. Hours passed, then days. Abeni did not return. At first, Zuberi enjoyed his newfound freedom. No nagging wife, no one to cook for, no one to clean. He could drink whenever he wanted, gamble as much as he pleased. But soon, things started to change. It began with the food. No matter how fresh, it would spoil within minutes. He would prepare a meal, only to find it rotting before his eyes, the smell of decay filling his nostrils. Meat turned rancid, water tasted foul. He threw out everything, cursing, but the problem persisted. Then, his money started vanishing. At first, he thought he had misplaced a few coins, but day by day, his stash grew smaller. Gold that had been hidden safely disappeared without a trace. He accused the servants, his friends, anyone he could think of. But deep down, a strange unease gnawed at him, and then came the whispers. At night, as he lay in bed, half drunk, he would hear it. "Abeni!" The voice was faint, almost like the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was her. Zuberi sat up, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he shouted into the darkness. Silence. He shook his head, laughing bitterly. "I'm losing my mind," he muttered, pouring himself another drink. But the whispers did not stop. Every night they grew louder, more persistent. "Abeni!" He would wake up drenched in sweat, the voice echoing in his ears. It was everywhere, hiding in the shadows, slipping through the cracks, whispering in the wind. It wasn't just the voice. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. Footsteps creaked when no one was there. The walls seemed to close in on him, suffocating, trapping him in his own nightmare. The villagers noticed. Zuberi, once a proud man, now looked haunted. His once sharp eyes were hollow, his face pale. He snapped at people for no reason, his temper worse than ever. He avoided conversations, spending more time alone, drowning himself in alcohol to escape the whispers. "Something is wrong with him," they whispered. "Maybe it's a curse." Zuberi laughed at their foolishness. A curse? Ridiculous. He was just having a string of bad luck, nothing more. But deep down, something in him trembled, because when he closed his eyes, he saw her, standing in the darkness, watching, waiting. The months passed in silence. In Mama Nia's small hut, Abeni fought for her life, her body weak from all the pain she had endured. But she held on for the sake of her child. Every night, she whispered to the unborn baby, promising love, protection, and a future free from cruelty. And then, the day came. Abeni cried out in agony as the baby entered the world, his tiny cries piercing the quiet village air. A boy, a strong, beautiful boy. Mama Nia held him close, tears of relief in her eyes. But Abeni was slipping away. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body exhausted from the battle it had fought for so long. She tried to reach for her son, her lips forming silent words. A blessing. He was her blessing. Then, with one last breath, Abeni was gone. Mama Nia wept, holding the orphaned child to her chest. She named him Baraka, for he was a gift from the heavens, a reminder of a mother's love and sacrifice. The village mourned Abeni's passing, their hearts heavy with sorrow. But Mama Nia vowed to raise Baraka with kindness, to teach him the ways of strength and wisdom. Far away, Zuberi had no idea that the son he had cast aside had entered the world. But something had changed. The nights had grown colder. The air inside his house felt thick, suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing down on him. The whispers that had haunted him before were no longer just whispers. They were cries, soft, distant at first, like a baby searching for its mother. But as the nights passed, the cries grew louder, more desperate. He covered his ears, but the sound seeped through his skin, chilling his bones. One night, he woke up drenched in sweat, his breath ragged. A shadow flickered in the corner of the room. He squinted in the darkness, his heart pounding. A child, small, barely visible, standing by the doorway. Zuberi scrambled backward, his hands trembling. He blinked, and the child was gone. But the nightmares had only begun. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes watching him, in the market, in the fields, even in his own home. When he looked into the water to wash his face, he saw his reflection, only he wasn't alone. Behind him, a small figure stood, pale eyes, a hollow gaze. He turned, but no one was there. He barely slept, afraid of what lurked in the darkness. His once strong body grew weak, his face hollow, his mind a battlefield of fear and confusion. The villagers whispered among themselves. Zuberi had become a shadow of his former self. He tried to drink away the terror, but no amount of alcohol could silence the cries. The child was coming, and this time there was nowhere to run. Late one evening, Seyfu knocked on Zuberi's door. He had heard whispers in the village. Zuberi looked sick, haunted, no longer the man he once was. When the door opened, Seyfu barely recognized him. Zuberi's face was hollow, his eyes sunken, his hands shaking. "What happened to you?" Seyfu asked, stepping inside. Zuberi sat down heavily, his breathing uneven. "I see him," he murmured. "I hear him." Seyfu frowned. "Who?" Zuberi's lips trembled. "The child, the one I threw away before he was born." His voice cracked. "He's here." Seyfu felt a chill. "What are you talking about?" Zuberi buried his face in his hands. The words spilled from his mouth. How he had beaten Abeni, how he had thrown her out, how he had laughed when she disappeared. Then the nightmares started. The whispers at night, the shadow of a child running through his home, the soft cries that never stopped. Seyfu's stomach tightened. He had known Zuberi for years, but now he saw the truth. Abeni had never been the problem. It was Zuberi. "You did this," Seyfu said, stepping back. "This is your punishment." Zuberi grabbed his arm. "You have to help me. Tell the villagers I was cursed. Tell them it wasn't my fault." Seyfu yanked his arm free. "Number. They deserve to know what you did." The next morning, the village was no longer silent. Seyfu had told everyone. The people who once greeted Zuberi with smiles now turned away. The market vendors refused to sell him food. No one invited him to gatherings. He was alone, just like Abeni had been. The night was dark, the wind howling through the village like a warning. Rain pounded against the thatched roof of Zuberi's hut. He lay on his mat, staring at the ceiling, his body cold with fear. Sleep had abandoned him long ago. Every night, the whispers grew louder. Every shadow seemed to move. Then a sound cut through the storm. Soft footsteps. Inside his hut, Zuberi shot up, heart hammering. He grabbed the knife beside him, his hands trembling. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, barely louder than the wind. Silence. Then a soft giggle, a child's laughter. Zuberi's breath hitched. He turned toward the door, gripping the knife tighter. The hut was dim, but he could see the outline of something small standing near the entrance. A child. Who are you?" he whispered, stepping closer. Lightning flashed, illuminating the figure. Zuberi's blood ran cold. The child's face was pale, almost translucent. His eyes glowed like burning embers. Zuberi stumbled back, shaking his head. No, this isn't real." The child took a step forward. "You threw me away before I was born, father. Now, it's your turn." The wind outside roared, rattling the walls. Zuberi's chest tightened, his knees buckled. Pain shot through his heart, like a knife twisting inside him. He clutched his chest, gasping for air. The child's face remained calm. "You left my mother to die. Did you think you would escape?" Zuberi collapsed onto the floor, his vision blurring. His heartbeat slowed, his body stiffened. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The last thing he saw was the child standing over him, eyes glowing in the darkness. Then, everything went black. Morning arrived with an eerie silence. The storm had passed, but the village felt different, as if the air itself carried a warning. No one had seen Zuberi since the night before, and whispers spread through the village like wildfire. Seyfu, Zuberi's old friend, was the first to approach the hut. He hesitated before pushing the door open, his stomach twisting with unease. The sight inside made him stumble back, his breath caught in his throat. Zuberi lay on the floor, his body stiff, his eyes frozen wide in terror. His hands were clenched over his chest, his face twisted in a silent scream. But it wasn't just his expression that sent chills through Seyfu. It was what lay beside him, a single, tiny footprint, too small for any living child. The villagers gathered outside, their murmurs growing louder. Mama Naya stepped forward, her wise eyes scanning the scene. She knelt by the footprint, running her fingers over the cold earth. A deep sigh left her lips. "The ancestors have spoken," she whispered. The villagers bowed their heads, understanding the truth. Baraka, the child Zuberi had abandoned before birth, had returned, not as a boy, but as a force of justice. No one mourned Zuberi. They only spoke of Abeni, the woman who had suffered, and the child who had been denied a father's love. They knew now that some sins could not be buried, some wrongs would never be forgotten. And as they left the hut, a quiet wind passed through the village. a whisper of a mother's love, a child's justice, and the curse that had finally been fulfilled. The village gathered in silence, mourning Abeni. Women wept for the pain she endured, and men bowed their heads in shame. She had suffered alone, but she would not be forgotten. Her name would live on, not as a victim, but as a symbol of strength. Baraka, her son, lay in Mamania's arms, innocent and unaware of the darkness he had survived. He had entered this world without a mother, but he was not alone. The villagers saw him as more than a child. They saw him as a message from the ancestors, a reminder that no evil goes unpunished. Mamania raised him with wisdom and kindness. She taught him respect, something his father never had. She told him stories of his mother, of her love, of her courage. Unlike Zuberi, Baraka would grow up knowing right from wrong. He would not carry his father's sins. He would break the cycle. Zuberi's hut remained untouched. No one spoke his name. No one asked what happened to him. The villagers did not see his death as a tragedy. It was justice. His cruelty had sealed his fate, and now he was just a shadow, a warning. Fathers in the village became more careful with their words, more gentle with their hands. Mothers reminded their daughters that silence was not strength. No woman's pain would be ignored again. Abeni's suffering had opened their eyes. Her story was passed down for generations, whispered by mothers to their children at night. A lesson of love, of pain, of justice. A man who destroys his own family will one day face the consequences. A woman's suffering does not go unseen, and a child, no matter how small, carries the weight of justice. Zuberi thought he could escape, that his actions would fade with time, but karma does not forget. It waits, patient and silent, and when it strikes, it does not show mercy. If this story touched you, like, subscribe, and share it. Let's spread the message of strength and justice. Your support can make a real difference.